In this section, we're going to discuss bioethics and the bioethical principles. And that's because bioethics are going to be the subject of our papers starting real soon here. So without any further ado, what is bioethics? Well, ethics is a philosophical discipline pertaining to notions of good and bad, right or wrong, morality, our moral life in community and as groups. And so bioethics is the application of ethics and ethical thinking principles, for instance, to the field of medicine and healthcare. And so ethicists and bioethicists ask relevant questions more than provide sure and certain answers. It's a probing discipline that's intended to tease out certain implications of actions or procedures or legislation even that might on the surface seem like it would be a beneficial thing, but needs a little bit more investigation. So that's what bioethicists do, and ethicists for that matter. And so just to give you some concrete examples of bioethical issues, like performance enhancing drugs in sports, yes or no? That'd be a bioethical issue. Human organ selling. Should we be allowed to sell a kidney if we would like to? Genetic enhancement and CRISPR technology and gene editing. Those are often bioethical issues. Physician-assisted suicide and prisoner experimentation. So what we're going to be using in order to examine these bioethical issues are the three bioethical principles, which were laid out in something called the Belmont Report. And the full title of the report is Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research, which seems pretty specific because it's saying it's, guidelines for protecting research subjects, but really they're applied across the board in any bioethical set of circumstances. So these principles were created by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, partially in response to the Tuskegee untreated syphilis experiment that ran between 1932 and 1972. And there is a video on that experiment for you to watch. And before we continue, the Belmont Report, it was named after a hotel where this took place, I believe in Maryland. They just called it the Belmont Report. But together, what happened is they got together philosophers, ethicists, physicians, nurses, clergy, lawyers, anybody who could weigh in relevantly on bioethical matters. It was a big conference, and over the course of a few days, they came up with and agreed upon three main ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. And like I said, that then in turn applied to any bioethical, any medical decision making, right? The idea is before you make decisions in medicine, you need to think through three pivotal important principles. And those are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And I'll talk through all three of these. So the respect for persons principle emphasizes the perspective of the patient, the person whose body we're talking about here. The person who is either deciding um, to participate in some research or have some sort of treatment done to them, or potential procedures done to them. Of course, well, the patient has a perspective. So respect for persons is meant to emphasize the patient perspective. And respect for persons encompasses some like sub items, right? Like autonomy. Individuals or patients should be treated as autonomous agents capable of making their own decisions regarding their health. And people with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So diminished autonomy, for instance, would be children, the elderly sometimes, people who can't be held responsible or cannot be fully responsible for their medical decision making. Right? So they're entitled to protection, and individuals otherwise should be treated as people who can make their own decisions regarding their health and welfare. Then there's informed consent, and autonomy is based upon informed consent. So that means that patients must be made aware of the full range of options available to them regarding any medicine or procedure or research, right? You got to let everybody know the risks and benefits. For instance, you can't just say, hey, do this medical experiment. It's for a new antidepressant, let's say, and it could make you feel really good, and it could be really beneficial to you. You have to allow people to understand the risks as well. Like if you've ever seen those commercials for antidepressants on television, where you'll see somebody a cartoon, and they're walking down the street, and there's like a dark cloud following them, and they're really sad, but then they say, and now here's this new product, whatever you call it, and then the cloud breaks apart and the sun's shining on them, and they're happy, and there's butterflies and unicorns and stuff, right? You can't just say, hey, take this and everything's going to be great. In the meantime, what's running in the background of those commercials, right? Side effects could include weight gain, suppressed appetite, suicidal thoughts. I mean, a whole host of stuff. So that's the informed consent aspect of the respect for persons principle. And then also truth-telling. Don't intentionally deceive or coerce people. So that's respect for persons. The second bioethical principle is beneficence, and that emphasizes the perspective of the physician or the researcher, for instance, or the organization in charge of a certain medication, for instance, right? And really addresses, the essence of the Hippocratic Oath. So philosopher William Frankena, he outlined 4 elements of the principle of beneficence. And the first is, one ought not to inflict evil or harm. First, do no harm, right? That sounds like the Hippocratic Oath. Then, one ought to prevent evil or harm if possible. Then, one ought to remove evil or harm if possible. And then finally, one ought to do or promote good. And this is the Hippocratic Oath broken down. And it's an oath that medical professionals take. And it's supposed to be the guiding principle of their profession. Beneficence. Right? But in any set of medical decisions being made, so now you have to concern yourself with the physician's perspective, which tends to be beneficence. And like we said earlier, you also have to take into consideration the subject, the patient's perspective, which is respect for persons. So that's beneficence. And then finally, justice. Justice is the third bioethical principle, and that emphasizes the perspective of society as a whole. So certain medical or biomedical decisions that are made don't just have implications for the patient and the practicing physician or group. They also will extend out into society and possibly change society, change law, for instance, right? So this is the third principle that you have to keep in mind when making these sorts of decisions, is the societal perspective, the health of society as a whole. And that breaks down this way. So resources are sometimes scarce, and the principle of justice is intended to ensure equal distribution of them, right? So this principle requires that social benefits like healthcare services, for instance, and social burdens like taxes be distributed in accordance with the demands of justice. And an injustice occurs when some benefit to which a person or group is entitled is denied without good reason, or when some burden is imposed unduly upon some person or group. So let me give you an example of that. Let's talk about the injustice aspect. Let's imagine that you have a group of, let's just say that it's people underneath the poverty line, right? And you simply want to study some aspect of this group, health aspect of this group. And, naturally, your subjects are going to come from the group that you're trying to study, namely people who exist below the poverty line. But that's considered a burden put upon them, because ostensibly whatever the results of the experiment are, if it's performed properly, is going to benefit everybody, right? Whatever they're trying to figure out about the health of people who live beneath the poverty line is going to end up benefiting everybody in the society. So the idea is that you can't just put the burden of what everybody's going to benefit from. You can't only burden one small group. One small group can't pay the price constantly for everybody when it benefits everybody. Somehow that's got to be offset and thought through carefully. So that's the principle of justice. So here's an example of a bioethical argument that emphasizes respect for persons. So here's the idea, is that bioethical arguments, any of them, are supposed to try to balance those three principles very carefully. If you imagine that each principle is like a ball that you juggle with, right? So respect for persons is one, beneficence is another, and justice is another. You're supposed to keep all of these in the air and not drop any ball when you're making these decisions. That's the purpose of these principles, right? But you'll often read bioethical arguments where you can just hear one popping. Like whoever wrote the argument is doing their best to keep all three of those principles juggling, but one sort of emerges as like the dominant principle, right? You can kind of hear it in the way that the argument is written. Now, these are just, I designed these arguments to really emphasize one principle at a time, just so you can get the flavor. So here's an example. Organ sales should be legal. The donor and the recipient have free will. They accept the transaction with a complete understanding of the risks and benefits involved, and no one has the right to tell people what they can and can't do with their own body. So notice, here's the conclusion, and then you've got pretty much everything else breaking down as the premises. These are all really emphasizing just one principle, and that's respect for persons. So in other words, this would be considered kind of an irresponsible bioethical argument because it's lacking emphasis upon the other two principles, namely beneficence and justice. Here's an example of a bioethical argument emphasizing beneficence. There is obviously some harm done to the donor in the surgery involved in organ donation. There is also immediate exposure to surgical risks, disfigurement, and loss of an organ. However, these risks of harm are so well defined in the kidney transplant process that donors can be assured that the risks, both long and short term, are minimal. On the other hand, the risks associated with the liver, lung, and pancreas donation process are not as well defined. Therefore, perhaps there should be a moratorium on these donations until the risks can be carefully assessed. This is a longer argument, and this is the conclusion down here, saying, hey, maybe there should be a moratorium on certain kinds of donations as opposed, or, just donations as opposed to others, right? But you can see, you can hear in the language, this is all associated with the principle of beneficence or the perspective of the physician. That's the one you can hear popping really loudly here is the physician's or the operator's perspective. And then here's an example of a bioethical argument emphasizing justice. The main benefit of payments for organ procurement would undoubtedly go to relatively privileged individuals who could afford it. They would get transplants more readily than others, in addition to all the other privileges that accrue to the wealthy, like better homes to recuperate in, healthcare service, etc. Obviously, paid donation is not a solution to the organ availability crisis. So down here is the conclusion, and then you can see that the concern, all the premises are concerned with justice, right? That one group, namely the wealthy, would benefit at the expense of the non-wealthy. That is a bioethical argument where justice is the principle that is emphasized almost primarily. So that's it for the bioethical principles. One last thing to keep in mind, again, is that these three principles are none is meant to dominate over the other. They should actually look like, if you were to picture it, darn it, I don't have my pen here, but if you were to picture them as like three pillars holding up bioethics. And they're all the same, like pillars would hold up in a building, right? Consider them to all they're supposed to be the same height. They're all doing the job of upholding bioethics, right? But often one will just be a little taller than the other because human beings are writing it, right? So this is the job of the bioethicist, is to keep these as well balanced as possible.